Texas, 1945. A freight train slowed by the grain silos and disgorged uniforms that did not belong to this side of the map. A sight like that in a town used to cattle and church bells seemed impossible. Dust rose in spinning curtains around boots, the sun bit the backs of necks, and the metallic tang of coal smoke mixed with the dry scent of hay. Markus, 22, pale and hollowed by months of hunger, pressed a scrap of paper into his palm and whispered in his diary line, "I thought freedom was a word they had taken away." The promise that followed was simple and strange, a chance to trade rank for work and humiliation for something that resembled dignity. To understand how cowboys changed the game for German prisoners, we must step back to the day the train stopped and the town chose what kind of people they would be. The camp sat behind a low fence at the edge of town, a cluster of barracks, a corral, and an infirmary that smelled of liniment and boiled coffee. Guards in olive drab walked with the easy boredom of men who had been given orders and not asked to think beyond them. Captain Miller, a compact man with a precise voice, kept a ledger and a tight smile. Sergeant Hayes was louder and relied on drills, the snap of commands always in his throat. The locals called the place a work camp, not a prison, and the language shaped how things were seen. Prisoners looked at the corral and at the ranchers who visited, trying to imagine a day where they might hand a saddle to a man who would not look away. The first impressions were small details, a cowbell that did not clang so much as ring a plain note, the roughness of a wool blanket rubbed smooth at the corner, the bright glare of a tin cup under the sun. Conversations between guards and the newcomers were guarded and short. Captain Miller said, "Where will they be housed?" Sergeant Hayes answered, "In the East Barrack until we sort papers." A translator named Lewis told Markus, "Stay calm for now." Markus replied, "We have nothing to hide." A local woman, Rosa, handed a blanket and said, "Welcome, the best we can." A prisoner named Otto looked at the sky and whispered, "Heimat," and nobody laughed. Routine hardened into rhythm quickly. Labor and rationing became the scaffold of days. Men and a few women were sorted by task and by the way their hands still remembered work. Some cleaned stalls, some fixed barbed wire, some learned to mend harness leather with fingers that had never held a needle. Food arrived in metal bowls. The stew smelled of old salt, and a single herb someone said was parsley. The taste was thin, but it was steady. Billets were measured by bunks, and privacy meant the space between two breaths in the night. In the mornings, a bell summoned lines, the feel of coarse wool at the jaw, the sting of sun on an unshaven face, the clink of metal tools, each movement a note in a larger machine. A small kindness emerged in the stall cleaning. A cowboy named Tom brought coffee in a chipped cup and let a prisoner warm his hands over embers. At first, the exchanges were transactional. Then they became questions and answers, and eventually names were used without suspicion. Tom said, "Hand me that shovel." Markus answered, "Here." Tom asked, "What were you before?" Markus said, "I was a baker." Tom smiled. "I can teach you to shoe a horse if you pay attention." Markus replied, "I have never seen a horse from this side before." Tom said, "Then we will start tomorrow." Maria, the cook, added, "That man needs a blanket at night." Markus thanked, "You do not need to do that." Maria said, "People here do what we can." Markus's childhood backstory came through in fragments of diary pages he hid in a boot across months. He was born in a small village near Bremen, the son of a carpenter who taught him the feel of grain and the patience of timber. As a boy, he learned to whittle small horses from scraps left over by his father. Those toys sat on windowsills, bringing quiet pride. He apprenticed at a bakery. The smell of yeast and warm crusts trained his hands to steady rhythm. War took his brother, and then took the work he loved, pressed him into uniform and into long marches. He wrote about the moment he realized orders could not fill a stomach, and about the first night away from his mother when he tried to remember the exact way she folded a loaf so all the ends stayed soft. These paragraphs in his journal described loss and a stubborn tenderness for small objects and for rituals of repair. Markus came to camp not as an ideologue, but as someone who knew how to mend a torn apron and who kept a carved horse that reminded him of his father. That carved horse would surface again and bind memory to place. The run to the ranch became the point where routine cracked and something unexpected took shape. A dusty road that smelled of sun-warmed leather and cut grass led them to wide fences and a low sky. The rancher Jed had a face creased by sun and a voice that could call cattle from the hills. He stood in a felt hat and watched the newcomers with a look that was more curiosity than fear. The first day at the corral carried at least 5 senses: hearing the slap of hooves, smelling horse sweat, tasting dust on the tongue, seeing the sheen of saddle leather, and feeling the weight of reins in new hands. The lesson in mounting was clumsy and tender, and it became a classroom where power was negotiated not by orders but by patience. Conversations across that afternoon stretched long and needed 8 or more turns to unfold. Jed said, "You cannot just throw yourself at the horse." Markus asked, "How do I begin?" Jed replied, "Put your weight here and feel it balance." Tom advised, "Hold the reins like this." Markus attempted, "I feel like I will fall." Jed encouraged, "No, you will not fall, just breathe." Otto added, "The horse answers you if you listen." Jed laughed. "The horses have better ears than some men," Markus said. "I am listening now." Captain Miller intervened. "Are they allowed to ride?" Jed answered, "They work for the ranch and riding is part of work." Sergeant Hayes asked, "Who will cover for guard duty?" Lewis answered, "We will rotate." Jed said, "Then try again and do not rush." This conversation looped with practical adjustments and with small jokes that eroded suspicion. The scene at the ranch was a pivot, not because orders changed, but because human rhythms shifted. The touch of leather, the weight against a thigh, the scent of horse and sweat, the sound of a distant dog, the taste of coffee offered in a tin mug, all combined into an education that was not in any manual. Music threaded through evenings. A cowboy song with a slow guitar was answered by a quiet hum of a German folk tune, and the exchange became a bridge. At the heart of the ranch episode was a tense moment when tradition and regulation nearly collided. 2 elements of law and compassion tested each other. The first tension came when a local procession accused the camp of harboring enemies and called for chains. Voices rose like wind in a storm, and the smell of smoke from torches filled the air. Jed stepped forward and said, "Enough. We will show them what work can do." He offered to teach the men to handle livestock and promised the town that their presence would not be a threat. That choice diffused anger, but left a thin line of unease between community and command. Life tightened into new patterns. Music at night became a ritual, with Tom strumming while Markus and Otto sang in German, a low baritone that made the corral feel like a chapel of patchwork hope. Names multiplied in narrative. Maria the cook fixed a stray button for a soldier. Carl the woodcarver whittled spoons and small horses, and Rosa kept a ledger of who borrowed tools. Cowboys like Sam and Eli taught not only how to ride, but how to read footmarks of animals, and how to tie a knot that would not slip. Crafts spread the reputation of the camp into town. Carl's craft reached the market, where he carved tiny horses that buyers thought quaint, and then discovered they were made by men who had much to say about labor and skill. Trade opened a new vocabulary for respect. A buyer named Mrs. Allen bought one small horse and later returned with a stack of blankets. Jed, backstory unfolded in 3 short linked paragraphs, then a final longer reflection. He had been raised in a ranch house where his father taught him to rise with sun and mend fences before breakfast. He learned patience from cattle and the practical theology of working land. As a boy, Jed had watched his mother stitch by lamplight and learned that objects held memory. A patched saddle could tell whole seasons. He had served briefly in a non-combat role during years of conflict and returned disillusioned with the bureaucracy of uniforms. His hands were roughened by toil and by the small acts of kindness his neighbors expected. He married young, to a woman named Ellie, who died in childbirth, leaving Jed with the ranch and a child he barely knew how to parent. That loss made him both stern and kind, the kind of man who would insist on boundaries and yet break them when compassion required. In those days, he kept a carved horse hung by the kitchen door, his own childish toy, a symbol that he believed work and small care could stitch a life back together. Tension rose again months later when news came that the war in Europe had ended. The announcement arrived like thunder, and then thinly as fog. First a radio crackle, then a paper posted by the captain. Eyes filled and shoulders slumped. Prisoners celebrated with tears and awkward laughter. Guards traded looks of relief or confusion. The town gathered and offered pies, and hands trembled. Markus wrote in his diary, "Today the papers say peace, and my hands know what to do with bread again." The decision about repatriation created an administrative storm marked by grief and bargaining. The procedure to repatriate required coordination of military records, travel permits, and customs for personal items. It involved a chain of custody where documents were logged by name, birthplace, unit, and a list of belongings signed by a witness. The protocol ensured safe transport, but often separated men from objects they needed to carry memory. The captain read the order. "We will send them in 3 batches, the first to leave next week." Men packed small bundles. The feel of folded shirts under the fingers, the taste of stale bread in mouths that wanted more. The departure day was a tight moment of moral tension. Families of townspeople came to the fence and did not know whether to hug or to watch. A train platform smelled of oil and cold metal. The call of a bell felt like an ending and not an ending at all. Markus hugged Jed without many words and slipped his carved wooden horse into Jed's palm. "Please keep this until I return." Jed nodded and said, "I will keep it safe." There were cries and a last exchange as the train lined up. Markus said, "Will I see you again?" Jed answered, "I do not know, but ride with your hands steady." Otto said, "The world has shifted," Tom said. "We will be here," Maria said. "Write if you can," Captain Miller said. "Careful, men," and the line moved with the clack of wheels and the metallic scent of departure. Return to homeland brought shock and the real work of rebuilding. Men arrived at port towns and found homes burned or occupied or silent. The sky over cities was the color of cold stone. The taste of bread was foreign and thin. Markus stepped off at a quay that smelled of salt and diesel and found his village with many houses gone. His mother thin and older by decades in an instant. He discovered that skills learned at the ranch were transferable. He could repair a cart, he could teach others to shoe a horse, and unexpectedly, these practical trades eased re-entry. War had broken social contracts, and re-establishing them required conversation, patience, and small visible acts like offering to fix a neighbor's door. Backstories deepened as people tried to place themselves. Markus reconnected to his past by giving away carved horses to children, and the act healed not only the giver but the receivers of memory. Tension surfaced again in homecomings when some neighbors insisted on seeing only guilt, while others remembered smaller kindnesses done long ago. Markus faced suspicion from an old client who had lost a son in battle, and the confrontation left him shaking. He wrote in his diary, "I do not ask for forgiveness, only for a chance to show I can be useful." That sentence carried the ache of men trying to rebuild reputations as much as houses. The wooden horse that Jed had preserved reappeared years later. It came in a plain box from a postal office, with Jed's neat handwriting enclosed. He said, "Keep this with you. The horse will remind you where you learned to ride." The object arrived smelling faintly of saddle soap and cedar, and it became a talisman in a house that had to grow new rituals. More tension followed decades later when an excavation for a town museum revealed artifacts from the camp, and a tiny carved horse was cataloged as an object of memory. The discovery prompted debate about what to display and how to name those who lived through the camp. Some argued for a frank panel that told uneasy truths. Others wanted a softer plaque. The museum committee met under fluorescent light, and voices rose, and then settled when an elderly Markus spoke. "There are no simple badges for what we felt, only songs and small objects." His voice carried the wear of years, and the meeting ended in a compromise: a case that held the carved horse, and a placard that told names and a short narrative about the ranch that taught men to ride and towns to listen. 1 month after the museum opened, small commemorations took place. A local school brought children who listened to recordings of songs sung by cowboys and by men. The sound of guitar and accordion layered together, and the air smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh paper programs. Descendants of Jed and Markus shook hands and awkwardly narrated family stories. 3 months later, a plaque was added with names of the prisoners and villagers who had kept diaries, photographs, and letters. Were digitized and shared with regional archives. The town's newspaper published accounts, and interest from a university historian led to a grant. 6 months in, a reconciliation ceremony was planned with a slow procession to the museum. The carved horse was carried in a wooden box and set under glass, and people read letters that had crossed oceans. The epilogue in that case read like a ledger of slow repair, not a miraculous erasure, but a deliberate binding of threads. In the museum, the small wooden horse sat under light, small enough to hold in one hand, but large in story. School children reached up behind glass and tracked the tool marks with their eyes. Older visitors saw the grain of the wood and remembered a name. On a rainy afternoon, a plaque was unveiled with a photograph of Markus and Jed sitting on a fence, a guitar leaning by their knees, and a caption that read, "Work taught them language, and the language made a place for memory." The ceremony ended with a song, half in English, half in German, and a quiet moment where an old Coleman tin cup passed from hand to hand. The symbol repeated the rule that simple objects can carry complex forgiveness. If you felt this story move you, you are not alone. Many viewers have written to say they cried at the image of a carved toy keeping a life together. Tell us in the comments which small gesture changed your view of another person. Start your sentence with "when" so we can read short memories and build a space for kindness. Sharing a line helps others see how empathy acts in small ways. It shows that compassion is not only in grand gestures, but in coffee offered at dawn, in a hand that steadies a saddle, in a letter sent across an ocean. Your sentence may be short, but it will help others understand that history is made of acts, and that sharing helps the community learn. Now we return to the narrative to follow the final journey of objects, letters, and lives, and to see how a carved horse stitched a future from patchwork days. The final lesson nested in the museum was a quiet insistence that humanity survives in choices rather than orders. The carved horse, a symbol repeated in photos at the entrance, a small wooden icon on the program and on lapels during ceremonies, reminded everyone that sometimes the most durable bridges are made by work, by songs, and by the courage to place a hand where suspicion once ruled. The plaque summed it. They came as prisoners, they left as neighbors. And the town learned that dignity can be taught with leather, a bridle, and a shared loaf. If this story touched you, please subscribe for more narratives that trace how ordinary acts shape memory and keep voices alive.